Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode in the series Dawah Ilallah, as we go through the look at the comparative sciences in a way to be more effective in our dawah. Doing a little bit of comparative studying now, and we're looking specifically at the Christians' evidence that they present to us regarding whether Jesus, peace be upon him, was actually crucified or not. And we said there are many alternative theories. We don't agree with any of these theories. My job is not to give you solutions. My job is simply to give you questions. I am not a motivational speaker. I'm a demotivational speaker. I'm not to tell you how great life is. I'm here to tell you how wrong and bad life is, especially if you're a Christian. If you're a Muslim, I've got lots of good news. So my job is not to give you what happened. It's to be a prosecutor. And so these are not beliefs that I hold. I don't believe in any of this stuff, to be honest. I'm not here to tell you nice, sweet stories about the crucifixion scene. I'm here to tell you why there are problems and why we cannot believe it as credible. That's it. So people may be upset with me, people may not agree with me. I'm not talking from a perspective as a Muslim. We are talking from a perspective as a student, simply looking at the text and saying, how can you get this interpretation from the text? We are asking you to question where you get these beliefs from. We as Muslims totally have a different understanding of what happened to the Prophet Isa, peace be upon him. That is very important to understand. If we look at the entire scene that is spoken about at the actual crucifixion, we're not whether it happened before, we're not interested in what happened later, how many days, all that, we're not interested. We are talking about the crucifixion itself. If we look at the crucifixion story, it looks as if you are looking at it from a Christian perspective and you believe that Jesus is a God, or is part of the Godhead, that he is a very incomplete God. How do we say this? Well, the idea of a God being killed and being dead for 3 days is not a very complete God, because a God is now separated from the Godhead. He is separated from himself. If you take your arm and you cut your arm off and you leave it on the side of the road without being put on ice or any medical treatment for 3 days, no matter what you do, it ain't going to come back to life again. It's going to remain very much separate from the body. So the idea that the Son of God or Jesus the Divine, whatever you might look at it from a Christian perspective, his dual nature of being both 100% man and 100% God according to Christianity, there is a big problem with the 3 days. If God is supposedly incarnated into Jesus and he is 100% man, 100% God, the 100% God is dead for 3 days. Therefore, the universe is without a creator for 3 days. It would be like saying to the earth, we do not have gravity for 3 days. What do you think the situation will look like after 3 days? There'll be nothing left. The whole of life as we know it would have come to an end. Just 3 days. So the idea of a God being away for 3 days, even if he has a backup plan with 2 others, it still means that there is an incomplete Godhead. And the idea of a God being misplaced for 3 days is very dangerous. Very dangerous theology to have. But some Christian theologians, in trying to resolve the cubic cube, have mixed up the colors and made it even more difficult by saying, no, but he wasn't just nowhere, because he wasn't in heaven, we know this. Because when he raises from the dead 3 days later, he says, do not touch me, for I have not been to the Father yet. So we know he's not in heaven. We know he's nowhere else. There's only one place he could be. And this is where Christian theologians say, no, he went to hell for 3 days. If he goes to hell for 3 days, then he's no longer God, because hell is where God is not. And therefore he becomes no longer God. The other issue is if he's down in hell, not that hell is down, but if we're looking at it from a loose understanding, then why does he have to go through the suffering of the crucifixion if he's really going to suffer in hell? Why does he have to go through suffering on earth and suffering in hell? Surely there would only be enough for him to suffer in one place. If he goes to hell, that would be required. He doesn't need to have to go through the crucifixion, the mocking, the floggings, and all the rest of it. surely he'd just go to hell. There's no need for both. What's the purpose? There's no ancient ruling for this to have happened. We don't see the likeness of it in the Old Testament, because Christians like to superimpose the Old Testament sacrifice of the lamb onto Jesus being the sacrifice. But we don't find the lamb, suffering in a burning fire in a furnace for 3 days, and then after that the lamb coming out without any markings on him and being fine. So the only similarity to it is something dying. But there's no idea of this 3 days in hell. And even if we put the sinless person, according to Christianity, into hell for 3 days, it creates so many other theological issues. So it creates the idea of an incomplete Godhead, or an incomplete God, not being whole. And this is just not acceptable to any reasonable human being. Even an unreasonable person cannot accept this. Even the atheist will go, So it's not possible for the concept to have been. And so if you add the idea that he went to hell for 3 days, the argument becomes even more confusing. So let's have a look at the next point that we come across when looking at the idea of the crucifixion, and that is the idea of the Passover. Passover is a festival that is celebrated. For the Jews, the Passover is a very important festival. It has very deep religious significance. And a large number of pilgrims from all over the world would be coming to the temple in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover at the time when Jesus, peace be upon him, was supposedly crucified, when the crucifixion took place. And they came for this specific celebration almost in the same way as Muslims would go on Hajj. Very, very pious period of time. They're not interested in anything else other than what they came there to do. It's a time where you're trying to get rid of the sins of the previous year or the sins of your past. Most people, it's a once-in-a-lifetime experience. So Jerusalem at that time would be filled with pilgrims. And some of these pilgrims would be indifferent or perhaps opposed to or even hostile to Jesus, peace be upon him, at that time. But a large number of those people who came would have come from Galilee, where Jesus came from, where he did all his miracles, where he did all the miraculous things that he did. And they would have been defenders of him. And they would have not been silent. There wouldn't have been 10 or 20 of them like we see in the movie. There would have been a few thousand of them. A great number that would have come. And they would have heard of the miracles that Jesus had performed. They would have had friends or cousins or somebody who would have known something. And so once Jesus had been arrested and had been securely tied up in the system, they would have made sure that they would have done everything to break him out. They would have caused riots in the street. They would have been protesting. You think what was happening in Egypt and places like that would have been something to make news of? This would have made more news. And even those people who came there for the celebration for the Passover would not have been interested in getting their hands dirty, because that would have broken the whole spirit of the Passover. So it's very, very unlikely that during this Passover that the crucifixion scene would have taken place at this time. And especially not for somebody who was so well known. It is likely that the whole idea of the crucifixion taking place at the Passover time was superimposed later by Christian theologians to make it look like, like the Passover sacrifice of a lamb, same Jesus was a lamb that was sacrificed. So the story was moved from whenever it actually did happen, or if it ever did happen, to this period of time. It would have not happened at this time. There would have been riots, there would have been protests, people would have been angry. No matter what had happened, there would have been defenders, there would have been haters, there would have just been chaos in the streets. There would have been those people that were part of the opposition, and those people that were part of the condemnation. So when we look at this, it is very unlikely that this took place. And it is not understandable as to what the rush was anyway to pass the sentence of death on Jesus during this time. If you know it's a heavy, very conservative religious time of the year, why not just wait for the 2 days to go over? After it's done, then you can do the public execution. Why do it at the time where you know it's going to cause animosity and violence and terror and hate and anxiety in the streets? And remember that the Romans were not interested in what Jewish custom was. They were pagans. And the Jews would not have wanted to break the spirit of the Passover. They would not want to have got their hands dirty in anything. And if we look at the account, it was Thursday evening. Friday is when the Passover began. Do you really think that the high priests and the bishops, important religious leaders, would want anything to do with a long trial, especially at 12 o'clock at night? So the whole story is extremely doubtful that it was on that period of time that anybody would want to have broken the spirit of that Passover period. Even modern Jewish scholars would say not possible. They would never have done that at that time, no matter how serious the crime, as we'll get to what the punishment actually is for blasphemy. And why the crucifixion? Why crucify someone for blasphemy? Never been done in the past, never was going to be done in the future. So when we look at this whole story, we find that it is of a very doubtful nature. In fact, more than doubtful, extremely unlikely. And if it didn't happen during this time period. It's time for us to take a break. When we get back from the break, we'll continue, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We're talking about the Passover in relation to the crucifixion taking place during this time. The Jews were very, very busy indulging in their own preparations for this extremely important time of the year for them, when they were going to come from all over the world, or the then known world, to come and celebrate a very important festival. And so they would not have been interested in indulging in a midnight trial, especially the great religious leaders of the day, whether they be Jews or not. Let alone the Romans waking up in the middle of the night at midnight to conduct a midnight trial. They would have simply said, keep the guy in jail. We will deal with him after the Passover. The Romans were too busy playing security guards for this whole affair anyway. And the religious leaders would not want to get their hands dirty. So spending the whole afternoon at the Roman governor's house, going backwards and forwards between the Romans and the Jews, and then back to the Romans again, how they take Jesus backwards and forwards is extremely unlikely to have taken place. And the whole idea of somebody being told to post guards in front of the tomb where Jesus was laid, again, is something that they wouldn't have wanted to be involved with, a Jewish security. Because they were convinced he was dead, according to the text of the Bible. So this whole idea that pious Jews would be involved in this blood sport at such an important time when they wanted to keep their hands clean is very doubtful. In fact, we know that it was a period of time that they didn't want to get their hands dirty, because when the trial took place, the Jews wouldn't enter into the courtyard because the text says they were afraid of defiling themselves. So if you're outside the courtyard and not wanting to get involved in the trial of Jesus and afraid of defiling yourself, don't you think you'd still be defiling yourself if you're outside the courtyard and you're still screaming and shouting, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him? It's no difference to where the location is. The difference is that you're still defiling yourself. It wasn't defiling yourself going into the courtyard. The courtyard did nothing to defile the Jews, to make them break the Passover. What defiled the Jews and broke the Passover was being involved in somebody's death. So the story doesn't make any sense. It's bad narrative. It's bad literature. It's bad thought in the way the process of the story is put together. It's not a way that a God would write a book or would write a text. It wouldn't have so many mistakes and problems and problematic areas in it. Now, we must also remember that the sanctity of this Passover was that it was a Sabbath period. The whole thing was as good as a Sabbath. And we know the Jews, how strict they were with keeping the Sabbath. They would look at this Passover preparation time just as much as they'd look at a Sabbath. And so they would not want to have been seen breaking the Sabbath, and they would not have wanted to be seen having anything to do with going and checking on tombs and taking bodies and making sure all this happened. So the whole idea of this happening during the Passover would not have happened. There's no one that I can find amongst the Jewish community that would have said, yes, it's likely that this would have taken place. They've got nothing to lose by saying it, because they don't believe he was the Messiah anyway. So they would say, yes, this happened, but they didn't. So we know that this didn't take place during the Passover. Did the crucifixion take place? Probably, but not at this time. Probably at a much later time or an earlier time. And they were superimposed over each other simply to give it some type of deep significance. In a similar circumstance, in years to come. We find that the Jews and the Romans didn't want to get involved.